My name is Maya Chen, and for 3 years, I was invisible. Not literally, of course. I answered phones, organized files, and brought coffee to executives who barely acknowledged my existence. To them, I was just the secretary on the 47th floor of Meridian Technologies, the woman who knew where the good pens were hidden and could fix the temperamental printer in conference room B. But being invisible has its advantages. People say things around you when they think you don't matter. They make assumptions, they reveal their true nature, and they never ever suspect that the quiet woman taking notes in the corner might be the one person in that room who actually owns a piece of everything they're fighting over. The day my boss, David Harrison, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Maya, you're just a secretary. Don't forget your place." I smiled politely and nodded. I'd been practicing that smile for 3 years. But inside, I was counting. Counting the shares I'd inherited, counting the days until the truth would surface, and counting the seconds until David Harrison would have to eat every condescending word he'd ever spoken to me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in Austin. I arrived at Meridian Technologies at 7:30, an hour before anyone else, because that's when the building felt most honest. The marble lobby echoed with my footsteps, and the security guard Kevin Santos always waved from behind his desk. He was one of the few people in that building who looked me in the eye when he spoke, probably because he understood what it felt like to be scenery in other people's important lives. Meridian Technologies occupied floors 45 through 50 of the downtown high-rise, and my desk sat in the reception area of the executive floor, perfectly positioned to watch the daily theater of corporate ambition. I'd been there since college graduation, hired as a temporary assistant who somehow became permanent furniture. My family had stopped asking about promotions after the first year. My sister Sarah, who worked as an investment banker in Dallas, had made it clear that she couldn't understand why I was content to remain stuck in such a basic position. My brother Marcus, who'd founded his own tech startup in San Francisco, would sigh whenever my job came up in conversation, as if my career choices were personally exhausting to him. During family gatherings at our parents' house in Westlake, I'd become the cautionary tale. While Sarah talked about her latest deal and Marcus discussed his company's funding rounds, I'd sit quietly at the dinner table, letting them assume I lacked ambition or direction. My mother Linda would pat my hand sympathetically and suggest I consider going back to school for an MBA. My father Robert, who'd spent his career climbing the corporate ladder at a manufacturing company, would nod along and mention that it wasn't too late to make something of myself. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I'd been playing a different game entirely. 3 years ago, when my grandfather passed away, I'd inherited something that came with strict legal conditions. The reading of his will had taken place in a sterile conference room at Patterson & Associates, where his longtime attorney had explained that my inheritance wasn't just money. It was a substantial stake in a company that had grown far beyond what anyone had imagined when my grandfather first invested in it decades ago. That company was Meridian Technologies. The inheritance came with complications. My grandfather had been an early investor, when Meridian was nothing more than 2 guys with an idea and a garage in East Austin. Over the years, through mergers, buyouts, and restructuring, his original investment had evolved into something much more significant. But the legal framework around those shares was complex, involving trusts and delayed vesting schedules that meant I couldn't simply walk into the office and announce my ownership. The attorney had been very clear. I needed to wait for the right moment, when the shares would fully vest and the legal restrictions would lift. Until then, I was bound by confidentiality agreements that prevented me from discussing my inheritance with anyone. So I waited. I took a job at Meridian Technologies not because I couldn't find anything better, but because I wanted to understand the company I would eventually have a voice in. I wanted to learn how it operated, who made the real decisions, and what kind of culture had developed around the success my grandfather had helped create. What I discovered was an organization that had lost sight of its original values. The scrappy startup mentality that had driven my grandfather's initial investment had been replaced by something colder, more bureaucratic, and increasingly disconnected from the people who actually made the company function. David Harrison embodied everything wrong with Meridian's evolution. He'd been hired as CEO 2 years ago, brought in from a larger firm with a mandate to, quote, streamline operations and maximize efficiency. In practice, this meant treating support staff like replaceable equipment and making decisions based purely on quarterly projections. He was the type of executive who spoke in buzzwords and measured success only in terms that would impress other executives. To him, I was just another operational expense, a necessary inconvenience who happened to be good at keeping his calendar organized. The other executives followed his lead. Jennifer Walsh, the HR director, had perfected the art of speaking to me as if I were slightly dim, using the tone people reserve for children or pets. Tom Bradley, the CFO, would hand me documents without looking up from his phone, treating me like a human filing cabinet. Rachel Kim, who ran business development, would interrupt me mid-sentence during meetings to ask someone else to clarify what I'd just said, as if my words needed translation from someone more important. But the worst part wasn't their condescension. It was watching them make decisions that ignored the very people who made their success possible. They'd eliminated the employee recognition program that had meant so much to long-term staff. They'd cut corners on office maintenance and equipment, creating a work environment that felt increasingly shabby and neglected. They'd restructured departments without consulting the people who actually understood the work, leading to inefficiencies that anyone paying attention could have predicted. I watched it all from my desk, taking notes and biting my tongue. I learned who was really driving the company's success and who was just taking credit for other people's work. I saw which departments were being starved of resources and which executives were padding their budgets with unnecessary expenses. I observed the growing disconnect between the leadership team and the employees who actually served our clients, and I documented everything in careful detail. My family didn't understand my patience. During Sunday dinners at Giuseppe's, our regular family restaurant, they'd pepper me with questions about my career plans and professional development. Sarah would lean across the table and speak to me like a guidance counselor, asking if I'd considered leveraging my current position to network into something more substantial. Marcus would suggest that I was undervaluing my potential and should be more aggressive about seeking advancement. Even my parents, who generally tried to be supportive, would exchange glances that suggested they were worried about my lack of ambition. I'd nod and smile, the same way I did at work. I'd thank them for their concern and promise to think about their suggestions. But inside, I was calculating. I was learning. I was preparing for a moment they couldn't imagine. The turning point came 3 months ago, during a staff meeting that perfectly captured everything dysfunctional about Meridian's leadership. David Harrison had called an all-hands meeting to announce another round of, quote, efficiency improvements, which everyone understood meant layoffs. He stood at the front of the conference room in his expensive suit, delivering a presentation about right-sizing our human capital, while the people whose jobs were being eliminated sat in uncomfortable silence. When he opened the floor for questions, Maria Santos, a customer service representative who'd been with the company for 8 years, raised her hand. She asked about the severance packages and timeline for the layoffs, reasonable questions from someone trying to plan for her family's future. David Harrison's response was a masterclass in corporate dismissiveness. He told her that, quote, personnel decisions are made at the executive level, and that she shouldn't worry about strategic considerations beyond her scope of responsibility. The room fell silent. Maria's face reddened, but she didn't say anything else. She just nodded and looked down at her hands. I watched from my seat near the back, taking notes as usual, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about poor management anymore. This was about basic human dignity, about the respect my grandfather had intended for the people who built this company. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and pulled out the folder I'd been keeping locked in my bottom drawer. Inside were all the documents from my grandfather's estate, including a letter he'd written to be opened only after my inheritance was fully vested. The legal restrictions had been lifted the week before, but I hadn't opened the letter yet. I'd been waiting for the right moment, and watching David Harrison humiliate Maria Santos in front of her colleagues, I realized that moment had arrived. My grandfather's letter was written in his careful handwriting, the same script I remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes. He explained that he'd structured his investment to eventually give me a voice in the company's direction, not because he thought I needed the money, but because he believed the company needed someone who understood its original values. He'd seen too many good organizations lose their way as they grew, and he wanted to ensure that Meridian Technologies would have at least one stakeholder who remembered that a company's success should be measured by more than just its financial performance. The letter included specific instructions about how to exercise my rights as a shareholder, along with contact information for attorneys who specialized in corporate governance. It also included copies of correspondence between my grandfather and Meridian's founders, documenting the original vision for the company and the promises that had been made about how it would treat its employees as it grew. Reading that letter, I understood that my 3 years of invisibility hadn't been wasted time. I'd been gathering intelligence, learning how the company really operated, and building relationships with the people who actually made it function. I knew where the problems were, and I had ideas about how to fix them. More importantly, I now had the legal standing to demand that those problems be addressed. The next morning, I called Patterson and Associates and scheduled a meeting with the attorney who'd been handling my grandfather's estate. I explained that I was ready to exercise my rights as a shareholder and that I wanted to understand my options for influencing the company's direction. The attorney was pleased but not surprised. He'd been expecting this call and had already prepared the necessary documentation. What I learned in that meeting changed everything. My grandfather's investment, combined with the growth of Meridian Technologies over the past decades, had made me the single largest individual shareholder in the company. I owned more shares than David Harrison, more than any other executive, and enough to demand a seat on the board of directors. The attorney explained that I could have claimed that seat years ago, but the delayed vesting had been designed to ensure I understood the company before I tried to change it. Now I understood it perfectly. I'd spent 3 years watching from the sidelines, learning how every department functioned, building relationships with employees at every level, and documenting the gap between the company's stated values and its actual practices. I'd been preparing for this moment without even realizing it. The attorney helped me draft a formal request to be added to the board of directors, along with a comprehensive proposal for addressing the company's operational and cultural problems. The request was professionally worded and legally unassailable, but its implications were revolutionary. I wasn't just asking for a seat at the table. I was demanding accountability for the decisions that had been made without shareholder oversight. We scheduled the presentation for the next board meeting, which was just 2 weeks away. The attorney would handle the formal notifications and legal requirements, while I would prepare the presentation that would explain not just my identity as a major shareholder, but my vision for the company's future. It would be the first time in 3 years that I'd spoken in that building as anything other than a secretary, and I intended to make it count. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. I continued my daily routine, arriving early and staying late, organizing meetings for executives who had no idea that I'd soon be their colleague rather than their assistant. I watched David Harrison prepare for the board meeting with his usual arrogance, reviewing financial projections and strategic plans that completely ignored the human cost of his leadership. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Decisions. I saw Jennifer Walsh circulate memos about, quote, maintaining professional boundaries and, quote, respecting the chain of command, apparently in response to employee complaints about the recent layoffs. During that time, I also began reaching out quietly to longtime employees, asking questions about their experiences, and gathering feedback about what they thought the company needed to change. I was careful not to reveal why I was asking, but I wanted to ensure that my presentation would reflect the perspectives of the people who actually made Meridian Technologies function. Their insights confirmed what I'd observed. The company had lost its way, and the current leadership was more interested in short-term profits than long-term sustainability. My family noticed that I seemed different during that period, though they couldn't identify exactly what had changed. At Sunday dinner, my mother commented that I seemed more focused and wondered if I'd finally decided to pursue that MBA she'd been suggesting. Sarah asked if I was interviewing for other positions, noting that I seemed less resigned to my current situation. Marcus actually complimented me on what he called my improved energy level, though he still couldn't resist suggesting that I should be more aggressive about networking. I let them speculate. In just a few more days, they'd understand that I'd been playing a longer game than any of them had imagined. But for now, I was content to let them think I was finally taking their advice about being more ambitious. The truth was so much more interesting than anything they could have guessed. The morning of the board meeting, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I'd spent the previous evening reviewing my presentation one final time, making sure every detail was perfect. I'd also selected my outfit carefully, a professional suit that commanded respect rather than the more casual attire I usually wore to my secretarial duties. As I walked through the lobby, Kevin Santos did a double take and whistled appreciatively. He'd never seen me dressed for a board meeting before, and his surprised smile suggested he suspected something interesting was about to happen. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the executive conference room on the 50th floor. I'd been in that room countless times before, but always as support staff, taking notes or serving coffee to the people who made the real decisions. Today, I would be walking in as an equal, with a voice that carried the weight of substantial ownership in the company. At 9:45, I received the call that would change everything. The attorney from Patterson and Associates confirmed that all the documentation had been filed correctly, and that my status as a major shareholder was now officially recognized by the corporate registry. He wished me luck, and reminded me that I had every legal right to be in that boardroom, regardless of how surprised the other attendees might be. I walked to the elevator with my presentation materials tucked neatly in a leather portfolio, the same portfolio my grandfather had given me when I graduated college, though I'd never imagined using it for something like this. As the elevator climbed toward the 50th floor, I thought about all the times I'd taken this same route to deliver documents or fetch coffee for the very people I was about to confront. The irony wasn't lost on me. The executive conference room was exactly as I remembered it. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin, a massive mahogany table that could seat 20 people, and abstract artwork that probably cost more than most employees made in a year. David Harrison was already there, reviewing his notes and arranging his materials with the precise attention to detail that he applied to everything, except treating people with basic respect. Tom Bradley, the CFO, was setting up his laptop for the financial presentation. Rachel Kim was on her phone, probably trying to squeeze in one last business development call before the meeting officially began. Jennifer Walsh entered just behind me, carrying her usual stack of HR reports and compliance documents. She glanced at me with mild confusion, clearly wondering why the secretary was dressed so professionally and carrying a portfolio into a board meeting. I offered her the same polite smile I'd been giving her for 3 years, but this time it carried a different energy. This time I knew something she didn't. The other board members began arriving promptly at 10 o'clock. Most of them were external directors, successful business leaders who provided oversight and strategic guidance for Meridian Technologies. I recognized them from the quarterly reports and company newsletters, but I'd never interacted with them directly. They were the people who approved executive compensation, reviewed major strategic decisions, and ultimately determined the direction of the company my grandfather had helped build. David Harrison called the meeting to order with his usual authoritative tone. He welcomed everyone and began reviewing the agenda, which included the standard items: financial performance review, strategic initiative updates, and executive compensation discussions. He moved through the preliminary business efficiently, clearly eager to get to the parts of the meeting where he could showcase his leadership accomplishments. As he spoke, I noticed how different the room felt when you were sitting at the table rather than standing against the wall taking notes. The board members listened with the kind of attention that comes from having real decision-making power. They asked pointed questions about revenue projections and market positioning. They challenged assumptions and demanded clarification on strategic decisions. This was the level of engagement and accountability that had been missing from the company's day-to-day operations. When David Harrison finished his opening remarks, he looked around the table and asked if there was any new business to address before moving to the formal agenda items. This was my moment. I raised my hand and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Actually, I have something to present to the board. The room fell silent. David Harrison's expression shifted from confusion to irritation, as if a piece of office equipment had suddenly started talking. Jennifer Walsh looked genuinely alarmed, probably wondering if she'd somehow failed to maintain proper security for the boardroom. The external directors seemed puzzled but not hostile. They were clearly trying to understand why someone who appeared to be support staff was addressing them directly. "I'm sorry," David Harrison said, his voice carrying the kind of condescending patience he usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to people he considered intellectually inferior. "But this is a closed board meeting. If you have administrative questions, you can schedule time with Jennifer after we're finished here. I opened my portfolio and pulled out the legal documents that established my identity as a shareholder. My name is Maya Chen, and I'm requesting to be seated as a board member based on my ownership stake in Meridian Technologies. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in 3 years of working in that building. David Harrison's face went through several distinct phases of expression: confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of angry panic as he began to process what I'd just said. Tom Bradley actually dropped his pen, the small sound echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Rachel Kim stopped mid-scroll on her phone and stared at me as if I'd just announced that I was an alien visitor. But it was Jennifer Walsh's reaction that I found most interesting. Her usual mask of professional competence cracked completely, revealing something approaching genuine fear. She'd spent 2 years treating me like an inconvenient piece of furniture, and the possibility that I might actually have authority over her decisions was clearly more than she could process. "I'm sorry, what?" David Harrison managed to say, though his voice had lost its usual commanding tone. I handed copies of the documentation to the board secretary, who distributed them around the table with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose job was to process information regardless of how surprising it might be. These documents established that I inherited a substantial stake in Meridian Technologies from my grandfather, Richard Chen, who was one of the company's original investors. The legal restrictions on my inheritance were lifted 3 weeks ago, which means I'm now entitled to a seat on this board. The external directors began reviewing the documents with the careful attention that successful business leaders apply to unexpected developments. I could see them processing the legal language, checking the signatures and seals, and cross-referencing the information with their own understanding of the company's ownership structure. These were people who'd spent their careers evaluating complex business situations, and they recognized legitimate documentation when they saw it. David Harrison, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling with the basic concept of what was happening. "This is impossible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We would have been notified of any major shareholder changes. There are disclosure requirements, legal procedures, all of which were properly followed," I interrupted, my voice remaining calm and professional, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. The inheritance was structured with delayed vesting to ensure stability during the transition period. The attorneys at Patterson and Associates have been managing the legal requirements throughout the process. Tom Bradley found his voice first among the executives. "How much of the company do you actually own?" he asked, his CFO instincts kicking in despite his obvious shock. I consulted my notes, though I knew the numbers by heart. 27% of outstanding shares, making me the largest individual shareholder. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. 27% was more than enough to demand board representation. It was more than enough to influence major strategic decisions. It was more than enough to fundamentally alter the power dynamics that had governed Meridian Technologies for the past several years. Rachel Kim was the first to ask the question that everyone was thinking. "Why didn't you say anything before? You've been working here for 3 years as a secretary." This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the chance to explain not just my legal rights, but my strategic thinking. I wanted to understand the company before I tried to change it. I needed to learn how Meridian actually operates, not just how it appears on financial reports. I wanted to build relationships with employees at every level and gain insight into the real challenges facing our organization. I opened my presentation portfolio and began distributing the materials I'd prepared. Over the past 3 years, I've documented significant operational inefficiencies, cultural problems, and strategic misalignments that are undermining our long-term sustainability. I've also identified specific opportunities for improvement that could enhance both our financial performance and our workplace culture. The external directors leaned forward with interest. This was the kind of comprehensive analysis they expected from board presentations, and the fact that it was coming from someone they'd never met before only made it more intriguing. David Harrison, however, looked like he was experiencing some kind of medical emergency. His face had gone pale, and he kept glancing between the legal documents and my presentation materials as if he couldn't quite believe either was real. "For example," I continued, referring to my prepared notes, "our employee turnover rate has increased 40% over the past 2 years, resulting in recruitment costs that have exceeded budget by nearly $300,000 annually. Exit interviews consistently cite poor management communication and lack of career development opportunities as primary factors in employee departures. I could see Tom Bradley's analytical mind engaging with the financial implications of what I was presenting. High turnover was expensive, and if the problem was as systematic as I was suggesting, it represented a significant drag on profitability that the executive team had been ignoring. Additionally, I continued, our client satisfaction scores have declined steadily over the same period, with specific complaints about project communication and account management consistency. This correlates directly with the turnover in our client-facing departments and suggests that our efficiency improvements may actually be reducing service quality. The external directors were taking notes now, treating my presentation with the serious attention they would give any major strategic analysis. Jennifer Walsh, meanwhile, looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. As the HR director, she was responsible for many of the policies and practices I was criticizing, and she clearly understood that my board position would give me oversight authority over her department. David Harrison finally found his voice, though it carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there at the beginning of the meeting. With all due respect, Maya, you've been working in an administrative capacity. You may not have the full context necessary to understand the strategic considerations that drive our executive decisions. This was exactly the response I'd expected from him, and I was ready for it. Actually, working in an administrative capacity has given me a unique perspective on how our strategic decisions actually impact day-to-day operations. I've seen how policy changes affect employee morale, how restructuring decisions create operational bottlenecks, and how leadership communication influences client relationships. I pulled out a specific example that I knew would resonate with the financially minded board members. 6 months ago, the decision was made to consolidate our customer service and technical support departments to reduce overhead costs. The projected savings were approximately $80,000 annually. However, the actual result has been a 30% increase in client complaints, a 20% increase in project timeline overruns, and the loss of 2 major accounts representing over $2 million in annual revenue. Tom Bradley was furiously taking notes now, clearly running calculations in his head. The numbers I was presenting painted a picture of penny-wise, pound-foolish decision-making that was costing the company far more than it saved. David Harrison's face had progressed from pale to flushed, and I could see him beginning to understand that my 3 years of apparent invisibility had actually been 3 years of comprehensive intelligence gathering. The fundamental issue, I continued, is that our current leadership approach prioritizes short-term cost reductions over long-term value creation. We're optimizing for quarterly financial reports rather than sustainable business growth. One of the external directors, a woman named Patricia Hernandez, who had extensive experience in corporate turnarounds, raised her hand. Do you have specific recommendations for addressing these issues? This was the question I'd been hoping for. The opportunity to present not just criticism but constructive solutions. I do. I've developed a comprehensive plan for restructuring our operations to improve both financial performance and workplace culture. I distributed the second section of my presentation, which outlines specific recommendations for organizational changes, policy improvements, and strategic realignments. I'd spent weeks developing these proposals, drawing on everything I'd learned during my 3 years of observation and incorporating best practices from other successful technology companies. The first priority is restoring accountability in our management structure. This means implementing regular performance reviews for executive staff, establishing clear metrics for leadership effectiveness, and creating transparent communication channels between management and employees. Jennifer Walsh visibly flinched at the mention of executive performance reviews. She'd been operating with minimal oversight for years, and the prospect of systematic evaluation was clearly unwelcome. The second priority is rebuilding our client service capabilities. This means reversing some of the consolidation decisions that have reduced service quality, investing in employee training and development, and establishing client feedback systems that actually influence our operational decisions. David Harrison tried to interrupt, but Patricia Hernandez held up her hand to let me continue. She was clearly interested in hearing the complete presentation before engaging in discussion. The third priority is aligning our financial management with our stated company values. This means evaluating all cost-cutting measures based on their long-term impact, not just their immediate savings. It means investing in employee retention strategies that reduce turnover costs. And it means making strategic decisions based on comprehensive analysis rather than quarterly pressure. I closed my presentation portfolio and looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. I'm not here to criticize for the sake of criticism. I'm here because I believe Meridian Technologies can be both more profitable and more ethical than it currently is. My grandfather invested in this company because he believed in its potential to create value for all stakeholders, shareholders, employees, and clients. I want to honor that vision while ensuring our long-term success. The room was quiet for several moments as the board members processed what they'd heard. Finally, Patricia Hernandez spoke up. These are serious allegations about our operational effectiveness. David, how do you respond to Maya's analysis? David Harrison seemed to be struggling with the sudden shift in power dynamics. For 3 years, he'd been the unquestioned authority in every room he entered at Meridian Technologies. Now he was being asked to defend his leadership decisions to someone he'd never considered worthy of basic professional respect. I think there may be some misunderstanding about the complexity of executive decision-making, he said carefully. Running a company requires balancing multiple priorities and making difficult choices. It's easy to focus on isolated problems without understanding the broader strategic context. Patricia Hernandez nodded thoughtfully. That's a fair point. Maya, can you provide more specific documentation for the issues you've identified? I'd been hoping for this question. I pulled out the third section of my presentation, which contained detailed data analysis, employee feedback summaries, and client communication records that supported every claim I'd made. This wasn't speculation or opinion. It was comprehensive documentation of systemic problems that had been developing over years. Here's the complete employee turnover analysis, including exit interview summaries and cost calculations. Here's the client satisfaction data, with specific feedback about service quality issues. And here's the financial analysis, showing how our cost-cutting measures have actually reduced profitability when you account for lost revenue and increased recruitment expenses. Tom Bradley reviewed the financial data with obvious interest. As CFO, he was responsible for the company's overall financial health, and the numbers I was presenting suggested that some of his department's recommendations had been counterproductive. These projections are quite different from what we've been reporting internally, he said carefully. That's because the internal reports focus on immediate cost savings rather than comprehensive impact analysis, I replied. When you factor in lost revenue, increased recruitment costs, and reduced productivity from overworked remaining staff, many of our efficiency improvements have actually reduced our overall profitability. Jennifer Walsh finally found her voice, though it carried a defensive edge. Employee satisfaction is always a challenge during periods of organizational change. We've been implementing industry-standard practices for workforce optimization. I turned to face her directly, maintaining the professional tone I'd perfected over 3 years of absorbing her condescension. Industry-standard practices should be evaluated based on their results, not just their popularity. Our workforce optimization has resulted in decreased productivity, increased costs, and reduced service quality. Those aren't acceptable outcomes, regardless of how standard the practices might be. The exchange crystallized something that had been building throughout the presentation. This wasn't just about financial performance or operational efficiency. It was about fundamentally different approaches to leadership and corporate responsibility. David Harrison and his team had been managing Meridian Technologies as if employees were expenses to be minimized, rather than assets to be developed. My proposal represented a complete reversal of that philosophy. Patricia Hernandez seemed to recognize this underlying tension. It sounds like we're discussing two very different visions for the company's future direction. David, your approach has focused on streamlining operations and reducing costs. Maya, your approach emphasizes employee development and long-term sustainability. Both have merit, but they're not easily compatible. This was exactly the kind of strategic discussion I'd been hoping to provoke. Actually, I don't think they're incompatible at all. Sustainable profitability requires both operational efficiency and employee engagement. The problem with our current approach is that it's optimizing for the wrong metrics. I referred back to my analysis. Companies with high employee engagement consistently outperform their competitors financially. Organizations that invest in employee development have lower turnover costs and higher productivity. Businesses that prioritize long-term client relationships generate more stable revenue than those focused on short-term cost-cutting. David Harrison's frustration was becoming more visible. These theoretical principles are fine in business school, but running an actual company requires making practical decisions based on real financial constraints. Which is exactly why I've spent 3 years learning how this company actually operates, I responded. These aren't theoretical principles. They're practical solutions based on detailed observation of our specific challenges. The tension in the room was palpable. David Harrison was clearly struggling with the realization that his authority was being challenged by someone he'd never taken seriously. Jennifer Walsh looked like she was reconsidering every interaction she'd ever had with me. Tom Bradley seemed torn between his loyalty to the executive team and his genuine interest in the financial analysis I'd presented. But the external directors were responding exactly as I'd hoped. They were treating this as a serious business discussion about strategic direction and operational effectiveness. They were asking probing questions, reviewing detailed documentation, and evaluating competing visions for the company's future. This was corporate governance working the way it was supposed to work. Patricia Hernandez looked around the table before speaking. I think we need to take a short recess to process this information and determine how to proceed. This is clearly a significant development that requires careful consideration. As the board members filed out of the conference room for their private discussion, I remained seated at the table, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. 3 years of preparation had led to this moment, and I'd presented my case as effectively as I could. Now the decision was out of my hands. David Harrison lingered near his seat, clearly wanting to say something but struggling to find the right words. Finally, he approached me with the kind of forced civility that barely concealed his anger. I have to admit, Maya, this is quite a surprise. I never would have suspected that you were capable of something like this. His choice of words was perfect, encapsulating everything wrong with his leadership approach. Even now, faced with evidence of my competence and authority, he was expressing surprise that I was capable of strategic thinking. It never occurred to him that his inability to recognize my capabilities might reflect poorly on his own judgment. That's exactly the problem, I replied calmly. You've been making decisions about people without understanding their capabilities or potential. You've been treating employees as expenses rather than assets. And you've been optimizing for short-term results rather than long-term success. Jennifer Walsh had been hovering nearby, apparently working up the courage to approach me. Maya, I want you to know that I've always tried to maintain a professional working relationship with everyone in the office. I looked at her with the same polite expression I'd been giving her for 3 years, but now it carried a different weight. Professional relationships require mutual respect, Jennifer. They require recognizing other people's contributions and treating them as valuable members of the team. That hasn't been my experience working with you. She opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. The power dynamics in that room had shifted so completely that she was still processing what her new reality might look like. Tom Bradley was the only executive who approached me with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than defensive hostility. Can I ask you something? Why did you choose to reveal your identity now? You could have continued observing indefinitely. It was a good question, and one that got to the heart of my motivation. Because I watched you eliminate the employee recognition program that meant so much to long-term staff. Because I saw you implement policies that prioritized cost savings over basic human dignity. Because I realized that waiting for the leadership team to recognize these problems on their own wasn't going to work. The specific incident with Maria Santos was still fresh in my memory, but it represented a pattern of behavior that had been developing for months. 3 months ago, David Harrison publicly humiliated an 8-year employee for asking reasonable questions about layoffs that would affect her family's financial security. That's when I decided that observation alone wasn't enough. Tom Bradley nodded thoughtfully. You're talking about Maria in customer service. I remember that meeting. Then you remember how he spoke to her. You remember the contempt in his voice when he told her not to worry about strategic considerations beyond her scope of responsibility. That's not leadership. That's bullying. The conversation was interrupted by Patricia Hernandez returning to the conference room. "We're ready to continue," she announced, and the other board members filed back in behind her. The atmosphere in the room had changed during the recess. The external directors had clearly been discussing not just my legal standing but the substantive issues I'd raised about the company's direction. Their expressions suggested they were taking my concerns seriously. Patricia Hernandez called the meeting back to order and addressed the room formally. "After reviewing the documentation Maya has provided, we confirm that she is entitled to a seat on this board based on her ownership stake in Meridian Technologies. We also believe that the operational concerns she's raised warrant serious consideration and further investigation." David Harrison's face went through another series of expressions as he processed the implications of that statement. Having me as a board member was one thing. Having the other directors treat my criticism of his leadership as legitimate was quite another. "However," Patricia continued, "implementing the changes Maya has proposed would require a comprehensive strategic review and significant organizational restructuring. These aren't decisions that can be made in a single meeting." I nodded, having expected this response. "I'm not asking for immediate implementation of every recommendation. I'm asking for a commitment to evaluate our current practices honestly and make changes where the evidence supports them." "What specific next steps are you proposing?" asked another external director, a man named Robert Kim, who had experience in technology consulting. I pulled out the final section of my presentation, which outlined a proposed timeline for organizational assessment and strategic planning. "I recommend forming a strategic review committee that includes board members, executive staff, and employee representatives. This committee would conduct a comprehensive evaluation of our current operations and develop recommendations for improvement." The proposal was carefully structured to ensure that any changes would be based on systematic analysis rather than personal opinion. It also included provisions for employee input and external consultation, making it difficult for anyone to dismiss as biased or uninformed. David Harrison clearly wanted to object, but he was in an impossible position. Opposing a systematic review would suggest that he was afraid of what it might discover. Supporting it would mean accepting oversight of his leadership decisions. Either way, his authority was being fundamentally challenged. "I think that's a reasonable approach," Patricia Hernandez said after consulting with the other external directors. "Tom, as CFO, would you be willing to work with Maya on developing specific metrics for evaluating our operational effectiveness?" Tom Bradley nodded, though he still seemed to be processing the rapid changes in his working relationships. "Yes, I think that would be valuable. Some of the financial analysis Maya presented raises questions that we should definitely investigate further." Jennifer Walsh looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. As HR director, she would be directly accountable for many of the employee satisfaction issues I'd documented, and she clearly understood that her position was now precarious. The meeting continued for another hour as we worked out the details of the strategic review process. I found myself in the surreal position of collaborating with executives who had been treating me as invisible for 3 years. David Harrison participated in the discussion, but his contributions were noticeably defensive and focused on protecting his existing decisions rather than exploring opportunities for improvement. As the meeting concluded, Patricia Hernandez made one final announcement that crystallized the fundamental change in Meridian Technologies' power structure. Given Maya's substantial ownership stake and her demonstrated knowledge of the company's operations, I propose that she be appointed to the Executive Oversight Committee with immediate effect. The Executive Oversight Committee was responsible for evaluating senior management performance and making recommendations about compensation and strategic direction. Appointment to that committee would give me direct authority over the very executives who had been dismissing me as irrelevant support staff. David Harrison's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might actually stand up and walk out of the meeting. The prospect of being evaluated by someone he'd spent 3 years treating as beneath his notice was clearly more than he could easily accept. But the other board members approved the appointment unanimously. They'd heard my analysis, reviewed my documentation, and concluded that I had both the authority and the competence to participate in corporate governance at the highest level. As the meeting finally ended, and board members began gathering their materials, I experienced a moment of profound satisfaction. 3 years of careful observation, detailed documentation, and strategic planning had culminated in exactly the outcome I'd been working toward. I now had the authority to influence Meridian Technologies' direction and the responsibility to ensure that my grandfather's investment served its intended purpose. David Harrison approached me one final time as the boardroom emptied. His earlier anger had been replaced by something closer to resignation, as if he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. "I suppose I owe you an apology," he said, though his tone suggested the words were difficult for him. "I clearly misjudged your capabilities and your position in this organization." I looked at him with the same professional expression I'd maintained throughout the meeting. "The apology I want isn't for misjudging me, David. It's for how you've treated the other employees who don't have board seats to protect them. They deserve the same respect and consideration that you're offering me now." He nodded slowly, perhaps beginning to understand that this wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about creating an organizational culture that recognized everyone's potential contribution, rather than making assumptions based on job titles or hierarchical position. As I gathered my presentation materials and prepared to leave the boardroom, I reflected on how different this space felt now compared to my first time entering it 3 years ago. Then, I'd been an observer, taking notes on decisions made by other people. Now, I was a decision maker myself, with the authority and responsibility to help shape the company's future. The transformation wasn't just in my legal status or my organizational authority. It was in my understanding of what leadership actually meant, and what my grandfather had intended when he structured his investment to eventually give me a voice in the company's direction. He hadn't just wanted me to have financial security. He'd wanted me to have the opportunity to influence how business was conducted and how people were treated in the process. Walking back to the elevator, I passed the reception desk where I'd spent 3 years answering phones and organizing files for executives who barely acknowledged my existence. Tomorrow, I would no longer be sitting at that desk. Tomorrow, I would be working from a different office, with a different set of responsibilities and a fundamentally different relationship with everyone in the building. But the most satisfying part wasn't the change in my own circumstances. It was the knowledge that Maria Santos and all the other employees who had been treated as expendable resources would now have an advocate in the boardroom, someone who understood their contributions, respected their dignity, and had the authority to ensure that strategic decisions considered their welfare alongside financial projections. The elevator descended toward the lobby, carrying me away from a meeting that had changed everything. In a few hours, I would call my family and explain why I'd been content to remain just a secretary for 3 years. I would tell them about my grandfather's investment, about the strategic review process, and about my new role in corporate governance. But first, I had a stop to make at the 47th floor, where Kevin Santos would be finishing his shift at the security desk. He'd been one of the few people in that building who had always treated me with basic human respect, and I wanted to thank him before everything changed. Because sometimes, the most important relationships are with the people who see your worth before you have the authority to prove it to everyone else. Kevin Santos looked up from his security monitor with his usual warm smile as I approached his desk in the marble lobby. The evening shift was quieter than the morning rush, and most of the building's occupants had already headed home to their families and dinner plans. But Kevin always stayed until the cleaning crew finished their rounds, a dedication to duty that reminded me why I'd always respected him more than most of the executives who barely acknowledged his existence. "Ms. Maya," he said, standing up from his chair with the kind of courtesy that seemed to come naturally to him. "You're working late again. That presentation folder looks important." I smiled, feeling a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. "It was important, Kevin. Very important. And I wanted to thank you for something before I head home." He tilted his head with genuine curiosity. Kevin had worked security for Meridian Technologies for almost as long as I'd been there, and we developed the kind of easy friendship that grows between people who recognize each other's humanity in a corporate environment that often seemed to forget such things existed. "Thank me for what? I'm just doing my job, same as always." "For treating me like a person," I said, meaning every word. "For 3 years, you've been one of the few people in this building who looked me in the eye when you spoke to me, who asked about my day because you actually cared about the answer, who made me feel like I mattered. Kevin's expression grew thoughtful. Everyone matters, Ms. Maya. That's something my father taught me when I was young. He said you can tell everything you need to know about a person by how they treat folks who can't do anything for them in return. The wisdom in his words struck me with particular force, given what had just transpired in the boardroom 50 floors above us. Your father was a smart man. And tomorrow things are going to be different around here. Better, I hope. I didn't elaborate on what exactly would be changing, but Kevin had the kind of intuitive intelligence that came from years of observing human behavior. He nodded as if he understood that something significant had shifted, even without knowing the details. Different can be good, he said simply. This place could use some fresh perspective. As I walked toward the parking garage, I reflected on the conversation I'd just had and how it contrasted with every interaction I'd experienced with Meridian's executive team over the past 3 years. Kevin Santos, who earned a fraction of what David Harrison made annually, understood more about leadership and human dignity than the man who'd been running the company. The irony wasn't lost on me. The drive home to my downtown loft gave me time to process everything that had happened in the boardroom. The adrenaline from the presentation was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep sense of satisfaction and anticipation. For 3 years, I'd been carrying the weight of knowing that I could change things, but wasn't yet able to act on that knowledge. Now, finally, I had both the authority and the opportunity to make a real difference. My phone buzzed with a text message as I pulled into my building's parking garage. The number wasn't in my contacts, but the message was brief and professional. Congratulations on today's presentation. The Strategic Review Committee looks forward to working with you. Patricia Hernandez. The fact that Patricia had taken the time to send that message meant more than she probably realized. It confirmed that the external board members were taking my concerns seriously and viewed me as a legitimate colleague rather than an interesting anomaly. That professional recognition coming from someone with Patricia's experience and reputation validated everything I'd worked toward. Inside my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto my couch with a view of the Austin skyline. The city lights stretched out below me, representing thousands of people going about their evening routines, most of them unaware that the corporate dynamics at one downtown high-rise had shifted dramatically that afternoon. But the ripple effects of what had happened in that boardroom would eventually reach far beyond Meridian Technologies' walls. I thought about calling my family to share the news, but decided to wait until morning. This moment belonged to me alone, a quiet celebration of a goal achieved through years of patient planning and careful observation. Tomorrow would bring phone calls and explanations and the complex process of helping my family understand how thoroughly they'd misunderstood my situation. Tonight, I wanted to savor the simple satisfaction of a job well done. The wine was good, a bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion without knowing exactly what that occasion might be. As I sipped it slowly, I reviewed the day's events and began planning my next steps. The Strategic Review Committee would need to be organized quickly, with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. The employee feedback process would require careful design to ensure honest input without creating political complications. The financial analysis would need to be expanded to provide comprehensive baseline data for measuring improvement. But underneath all the practical considerations was a deeper satisfaction that had nothing to do with corporate governance or strategic planning. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to pretend to be smaller than I was. I didn't have to smile politely while people treated me as insignificant. I didn't have to hide my intelligence or downplay my capabilities to make other people more comfortable. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. The woman who had walked into that boardroom this morning was the same person who had been answering phones and filing documents for 3 years. But now everyone else would have to see her clearly. The invisibility that had been imposed on me by other people's assumptions was finally broken. My phone rang, interrupting my reflections. The caller ID showed my sister Sarah's name, which surprised me. We usually communicated through group family texts rather than individual calls, and it was unusual for her to reach out on a weeknight when she was typically focused on her own demanding career. "Hey, Sarah," I answered, curious about what had prompted the call. "Maya, I just got the strangest email from Mom," Sarah said without preamble. "She said you called her this afternoon and told her you had big news to share at Sunday dinner, but you wouldn't give her any details. She's driving herself crazy trying to figure out what's going on. I smiled, remembering the brief conversation I'd had with my mother after leaving the office. I'd been deliberately vague, wanting to share the full story in person rather than trying to explain it over the phone. I do have news, big news, but I want to tell everyone together. Come on, Maya, Sarah pressed, her voice carrying the slightly patronizing tone she often used when discussing my life decisions. How big can it be? Did you finally get a promotion? Are you seeing someone? The assumptions in her questions perfectly captured how my family viewed my life and possibilities. Even when presented with evidence that something significant had happened, Sarah's imagination couldn't stretch beyond minor career advancement or romantic developments. The idea that I might have achieved something genuinely impressive simply wasn't within her conceptual framework. It's bigger than that, I said, keeping my voice light and mysterious. Much bigger. You're being ridiculous, Sarah said, though I could hear curiosity creeping into her tone. Just tell me what happened. I promise I won't tell Mom you spoiled the surprise. But I held firm. This was a conversation that needed to happen face to face, with the whole family present, so they could all process the information together. You'll have to wait until Sunday, just like everyone else. After Sarah hung up with obvious frustration, I considered what that conversation would be like. For 3 years, my family had operated under the assumption that my life was a cautionary tale about missed opportunities and poor decisions. They'd constructed an entire narrative about my failures and limitations, reinforcing it through countless small comments and worried conversations. Dismantling that narrative would require more than just sharing facts. It would require helping them understand how completely they'd misunderstood everything. The challenge wasn't just that they'd been wrong about my circumstances. The challenge was that their wrongness revealed something uncomfortable about their values and assumptions. They'd been so focused on external markers of success, job titles, salary levels, social media presentations, that they'd completely missed the substance of what I was actually doing. That blindness wasn't just about me. It reflected a broader inability to recognize value that didn't fit their preconceived categories. But I wasn't angry with them, exactly. Their assumptions had been logically consistent with the information they'd been given, and I'd deliberately withheld the information that would have changed their conclusions. They'd acted on incomplete data, just like David Harrison and his executive team had done when they'd dismissed me as irrelevant support staff. The difference was that my family's dismissal had come from love and concern, however misguided, while the workplace dismissal had come from arrogance and contempt. Wednesday morning brought the first visible signs of how dramatically things had changed at Meridian Technologies. I arrived at the office to find Jennifer Walsh waiting by my desk with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. She'd clearly been there for some time, probably hoping to catch me before other employees arrived and witnessed whatever conversation she felt compelled to have. Maya, she said as I approached, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that fooled no one. I was hoping we could talk privately about yesterday's board meeting. I think there might be some misunderstandings that we should clear up. I set down my coffee and regarded her with the same polite attention I'd been giving her for 3 years. What kind of misunderstandings, Jennifer? Well, she began, clearly having rehearsed this conversation. I want you to know that I've always considered you a valued member of our support team. If there have been communication issues, I'm certainly willing to work on improving our professional relationship. The careful language of her statement was fascinating. She was acknowledging that problems existed while simultaneously minimizing them as quote, communication issues and misunderstandings. There was no recognition that her treatment of me had been fundamentally disrespectful, no acknowledgement that her assumptions about my capabilities had been wrong, and certainly no apology for 3 years of condescension. I appreciate that, Jennifer, I replied, maintaining my professional tone. As a member of the Executive Oversight Committee, I'll be very interested in reviewing our HR policies and practices to ensure they promote respectful communication at all levels of the organization. The reminder of my new authority clearly hit her like a physical blow. Her forced smile faltered, and I could see her processing the implications of having someone she'd treated dismissively now in a position to evaluate her professional performance. The power dynamic between us had reversed completely, and she was still struggling to adjust to the new reality. Of course, she managed to say. I look forward to working with you in your new capacity. But as she walked away, I could see the tension in her shoulders and the quick pace of her steps. Jennifer Walsh was smart enough to understand that her position was now precarious, and she was probably already planning damage control strategies to protect herself from the consequences of her past behavior. Tom Bradley's approach was entirely different. He appeared at my desk an hour later with a stack of financial reports and a genuinely collaborative attitude. Unlike Jennifer's defensive maneuvering, Tom seemed to recognize that my appointment to the board represented an opportunity for improvement rather than a threat to his authority. "I've been thinking about the analysis you presented yesterday," he said, settling into the chair beside my desk, "particularly the correlation between employee turnover and client satisfaction scores. I'd like to work with you on developing more comprehensive metrics for measuring organizational health." This was exactly the kind of constructive response I'd been hoping for. Tom was approaching our new working relationship as a professional collaboration rather than a political challenge, which suggested that he was secure enough in his own competence to welcome oversight and input. "I think that's an excellent idea," I replied, genuinely pleased by his attitude. "I've been tracking some additional data points that might be useful for developing a more complete picture of our operational effectiveness." We spent the next hour reviewing financial projections and discussing methodologies for measuring the true cost of employee turnover. Tom's analytical skills were impressive, and he quickly grasped the implications of the patterns I'd been documenting. More importantly, he seemed genuinely committed to developing solutions rather than defending existing practices. "You know," he said as our conversation wound down, "I have to admit that I never paid much attention to the employee satisfaction surveys. I always assumed that was Jennifer's domain, but looking at these numbers, I can see how employee morale directly impacts our bottom line." His comment illustrated something important about how organizational silos had prevented effective decision-making at Meridian Technologies. Each department had been operating independently, without sufficient communication or coordination to understand how their decisions affected other areas of the business. Tom's financial focus and Jennifer's HR responsibilities should have been closely integrated, but instead they'd been treated as separate concerns. "That's exactly why I think the Strategic Review Committee needs to include representatives from every department," I said. "We need to break down some of these artificial barriers and start making decisions based on comprehensive analysis rather than departmental priorities." David Harrison's reaction to the new dynamic was more complex and harder to read. He spent the morning in his office with the door closed, emerging only for essential meetings, and avoiding the kind of casual interactions that had previously marked his management style. When he did speak to me, his tone was carefully neutral, as if he was still processing how to navigate our changed relationship. The shift in his behavior was noticeable to other employees as well. Maria Santos, the customer service representative who had been humiliated during the layoff announcement, stopped by my desk with a curious expression. "Is everything okay with Mr. Harrison?" she asked quietly. "He seems different today. Less commanding, I guess." I smiled at her perceptive observation. "I think he's adjusting to some changes in the company's leadership structure. Things might be different around here for a while." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Different how? Good different or bad different?" "Good different, I hope," I replied. "Changes that focus more on supporting employees and improving our work environment." The conversation reminded me why I'd been so motivated to act when I saw Maria being dismissed and disrespected. She was intelligent, observant, and genuinely committed to doing good work for the company. She deserved to be treated with dignity and given opportunities to contribute meaningfully. The fact that David Harrison had felt comfortable humiliating her in public said everything anyone needed to know about his leadership philosophy. By lunchtime, word of my appointment to the board had spread throughout the office, though the details remained vague and subject to speculation. I could see clusters of employees having whispered conversations, trying to piece together what had happened and what it might mean for their own situations. The rumor mill was operating at full capacity, with theories ranging from the plausible to the wildly imaginative. Rachel Kim was the most direct in her approach to gathering information. She cornered me near the elevator bank during the lunch hour rush, clearly hoping that a semi-public conversation would prevent me from being too frank in my responses. "Maya," she said with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes, "congratulations on your board appointment." I have to admit, it came as quite a surprise to everyone. Her tone carried just enough edge to suggest that the surprise hadn't been entirely pleasant for her. Rachel had built her career on careful relationship management and political positioning, and my sudden elevation to board-level authority had disrupted all her carefully cultivated alliances. "Thank you, Rachel," I replied pleasantly. "I'm looking forward to contributing to the company's strategic planning process." "I'm sure you are," she said, her smile becoming even more artificial. "I suppose we'll all need to adjust to the new dynamic. It's unusual to have someone move directly from administrative support to board-level governance." The comment was carefully crafted to sound congratulatory while actually undermining my credibility. By emphasizing my previous role as administrative support, Rachel was suggesting that my appointment was somehow inappropriate or unearned. It was a subtle form of professional sabotage, designed to plant doubt about my qualifications without making any direct accusations. But I'd been preparing for exactly this kind of response. Actually, my role for the past 3 years has been more of an extended observation and analysis period. I've been learning how the company operates at every level, which has given me a unique perspective on our organizational strengths and challenges. My response reframed my previous position as strategic preparation rather than career stagnation, while simultaneously suggesting that I'd been gathering intelligence about company operations, including her department's performance. The implication wasn't lost on Rachel, whose smile faltered slightly as she processed the potential ramifications. "Well," she said, clearly eager to end the conversation, "I'm sure your perspective will be valuable to the board's deliberations." As she walked away, I reflected on how differently various people were responding to the change in my status. Tom Bradley saw opportunity for collaboration. Jennifer Walsh saw threat to her authority. Rachel Kim saw disruption to her political calculations. David Harrison saw challenge to his leadership. Each response revealed something important about their character and their approach to professional relationships. The afternoon brought my first official task as a board member, reviewing the preliminary materials for the Strategic Review Committee. Patricia Hernandez had emailed me a comprehensive packet of documents, including organizational charts, financial summaries, and policy manuals that would serve as baseline information for our evaluation process. Reading through these materials with my new authority was a completely different experience from my previous 3 years of observation. Now I wasn't just noting problems and inefficiencies for my own understanding. I was identifying specific areas that needed systematic review and improvement. The shift from passive observation to active responsibility was both exhilarating and sobering. The organizational charts, in particular, revealed structural problems that hadn't been obvious from my previous perspective. Reporting relationships were unnecessarily complex, with multiple layers of management that seemed designed to insulate senior executives from direct contact with operational staff. Decision-making authority was concentrated at the top, with little delegation of responsibility to department managers who actually understood the day-to-day challenges of their areas. More troubling were the policy manuals, which contained numerous examples of procedures that prioritized administrative convenience over employee welfare. The vacation request process required approval from 3 different supervisors. The professional development budget was controlled entirely by executive discretion, with no transparent criteria for allocation. The grievance procedure was so complex and intimidating that most employees would probably choose to endure problems rather than navigate the bureaucratic maze required to address them. These weren't just abstract policy problems, they were systematic barriers to employee engagement and organizational effectiveness. Every unnecessary approval layer reduced efficiency. Every opaque process created opportunities for favoritism and discrimination. Every bureaucratic obstacle discouraged innovation and initiative. As I worked through the materials, I began developing a framework for the strategic review that would address both immediate operational issues and deeper structural problems. The goal wasn't just to fix specific policies, but to create a more responsive and adaptive organizational culture that could evolve with changing business needs. My phone buzzed with another text message from my family group chat. This time it was my brother Marcus, who apparently had been brought up to speed on my mysterious news announcement by Sarah. "Mom says you have big news but won't tell anyone what it is. Are you pregnant? Getting married? Moving to another city?" The suspense is killing us all. The fact that even Marcus, with his entrepreneurial background, couldn't imagine news that didn't fit into conventional life milestone categories perfectly illustrated the limitation of their thinking about my situation. They'd become so accustomed to seeing me as the family disappointment that genuine professional success simply wasn't within their conceptual framework. I typed back a brief response. None of the above. Something much more interesting. You'll have to wait until Sunday. The exchange reminded me that I had less than 4 days to figure out how to explain 3 years of strategic deception to people who thought they knew me better than anyone else in the world. The conversation wouldn't just be about my hidden inheritance and corporate authority. It would be about trust, communication, and the assumptions that families make about each other's lives and capabilities. But that was a challenge for the weekend. For now, I had work to do. Real work, with real authority and real potential to create positive change for hundreds of employees who deserved better leadership than they'd been receiving. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself settling into my new role with surprising ease. The skills I'd developed during 3 years of careful observation and analysis translated perfectly to strategic planning and organizational assessment. The difference was that now I had the authority to act on my insights rather than simply documenting them for future reference. By the time 5 o'clock arrived, I'd made significant progress on the strategic review framework and established preliminary timelines for committee formation and data collection. More importantly, I'd begun to understand how my new position would allow me to address the systematic problems that had been frustrating me for years. As I prepared to leave the office, I noticed that the atmosphere on the 47th floor had already begun to shift subtly. Employees were more animated in their conversations, as if the prospect of organizational change had injected new energy into their daily routines. Jennifer Walsh was notably less imperious in her interactions with support staff. Even David Harrison seemed more thoughtful and less dismissive in his communications. The changes were small and probably temporary. Real cultural transformation would take months or years to achieve. But the mere possibility that things could be different had already begun to alter the dynamic in positive ways. Walking toward the elevator, I passed Maria Santos at her desk and noticed that she was smiling as she worked. It was a small thing, but it represented exactly what I'd been hoping to accomplish. People deserve to feel valued and respected in their work environment. They deserved leadership that recognized their contributions and supported their professional development. They deserved better than they'd been getting from Meridian Technologies' executive team. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to create positive change. The Strategic Review Committee would need to be organized. Employee feedback mechanisms would need to be designed. Policy reforms would need to be researched and proposed. The work would be complex and sometimes difficult, but it would also be meaningful in ways that my previous 3 years of observation could never have been. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the direction my life was taking. The woman who had walked into this building 3 years ago as a recent college graduate had been smart and motivated, but largely inexperienced. The woman leaving today was seasoned, strategic, and armed with both the knowledge and authority necessary to create real change. Kevin Santos waved goodbye from his security desk, and I waved back with genuine warmth. Tomorrow, our relationship would be different. I would no longer be just another employee he was friendly with, but someone with genuine authority to address the organizational problems we'd occasionally discuss during our casual conversations. But I hoped that the mutual respect and human connection that had developed between us would remain unchanged, regardless of how much my professional circumstances had evolved. Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Westlake had always followed the same predictable pattern. My mother would spend hours preparing elaborate dishes that showcased her culinary skills. My father would open a bottle of wine that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. And my siblings would arrive with carefully curated stories about their latest professional achievements. I would sit quietly, smile politely, and endure another evening of being treated as the family's cautionary tale about wasted potential. But this Sunday was different. This Sunday, I drove up the winding driveway of my childhood home carrying knowledge that would shatter every assumption my family had made about my life for the past 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very people who had spent countless hours worrying about my lack of direction were about to discover that I'd been playing a more sophisticated game than any of them had imagined. My mother greeted me at the front door with the mixture of affection and concern that had become her default expression whenever she looked at me. "Maya, sweetheart, you look different somehow. More confident, maybe? I hope this news you mentioned is something good." I hugged her warmly, feeling a rush of anticipation about finally being able to share the truth. "It's definitely something good, Mom. Really good." Sarah and Marcus were already in the living room, drinks in hand, engaged in their usual pre-dinner conversation about market trends and business opportunities. They looked up as I entered, and I could see the curiosity practically radiating from them. 3 days of speculation had clearly taken its toll on their patience. "Finally," Sarah said, setting down her wine glass with theatrical emphasis. "I've been losing sleep, wondering what could possibly be so important that you'd turn into a sphinx about it." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Seriously, Maya, the mystery is killing us. Just tell us what happened." My father emerged from the kitchen carrying a cheese board that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. He'd always been the type of man who expressed affection through expensive gestures rather than direct communication, and his elaborate dinner preparations were his way of showing love for his family. "Before we start," he said, settling into his favorite armchair, "I want everyone to know how proud I am of all 3 of my children. Sarah's latest merger deal, Marcus's successful funding round, and Maya's, well, whatever news Maya has to share." The slight hesitation before mentioning my news perfectly captured how my family had learned to think about my life. They loved me and wanted the best for me, but they'd run out of achievements to celebrate years ago. My father's careful phrasing was his attempt to be supportive, while acknowledging that he had no idea what I might have accomplished that would warrant celebration. I took a deep breath and decided to start with the revelation that would be easiest for them to understand. 3 years ago, when Grandpa passed away, I inherited something significant from his estate. Something I haven't been able to tell you about until now because of legal restrictions. The room fell silent. My grandfather had been a successful businessman who'd made strategic investments throughout his career, but none of us had known the specifics of his financial portfolio. His will had been read privately, with individual beneficiaries meeting separately with attorneys to learn about their inheritances. "What kind of inheritance?" my mother asked, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "I thought you just received some of his personal effects and a small trust fund." "That's what I let you believe," I said carefully, but the reality was much more complex. Grandpa was one of the original investors in a company that has grown substantially over the past few decades. My inheritance wasn't just money, it was a significant ownership stake in that company. Sarah leaned forward with the kind of intense focus she usually reserved for analyzing financial documents. "What company? And how significant are we talking about?" I paused, knowing that the next sentence would change everything. "Meridian Technologies. I own 27% of the company where I've been working for the past 3 years." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my family's living room. My father's wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. My mother's eyes widened to an almost comical degree. Sarah's mouth actually fell open, as if her brain had temporarily short-circuited while processing the information. Marcus was the first to find his voice. "Wait, you own what? How much of your company?" 27%, I repeated, "which makes me the largest individual shareholder and entitles me to a seat on the board of directors." "A seat on the..." Sarah started, then stopped, clearly struggling to reconcile this information with her understanding of my professional situation. "Maya, are you telling us that you've been serving coffee and answering phones at a company you actually own?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I said, unable to suppress a smile at her incredulous expression. "For 3 years, I've been observing how the company operates, learning about its strengths and weaknesses, and preparing to exercise my authority as a major shareholder." My father set down his wine glass with the careful precision of someone whose worldview was undergoing rapid reconstruction. "But why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think? Why did you let us worry about your career prospects when you were actually..." "When I was actually what, Dad?" I asked gently. "When I was actually in control of my own situation? When I was actually pursuing a long-term strategy rather than just drifting through life without direction?" The question hung in the air, forcing all of them to confront the assumptions they'd been making about my capabilities and judgment. For 3 years, they'd operated under the belief that I lacked ambition, planning skills, and professional competence. Now they were learning that I'd been executing a sophisticated strategy that none of them had even imagined possible. My mother was the first to process the emotional implications of the revelation. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and regret. "We've been treating you like you needed our help and guidance when you were actually more successful than any of us realized. More successful than any of us, period," Marcus added, his entrepreneur's mind clearly working through the financial implications. "Maya, do you understand what 27% of a technology consulting firm is worth? Especially one that's been growing for as long as Meridian has." I nodded, though I could see that he was still struggling to accept the reality of my situation. "I understand perfectly. I also understand that wealth without purpose is meaningless, which is why I spent 3 years learning how to use my authority responsibly." Sarah had recovered enough from her initial shock to start asking the detailed questions that her investment banking background had trained her to pursue. "What kind of legal restrictions were you dealing with? Why couldn't you exercise your ownership rights immediately?" I explained about the delayed vesting schedule, the confidentiality agreements, and the trust structure that my grandfather had established to ensure I would understand the company before trying to change it. As I talked them through the legal complexities, I could see their respect for both my grandfather's wisdom and my own patience growing. "So this past Tuesday," I continued, "when the legal restrictions were finally lifted, I walked into a board meeting and presented a comprehensive analysis of the company's operational problems, along with specific recommendations for improvement." "And how did that go?" my father asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer. "Let's just say that my boss, who has spent 3 years treating me like I was barely competent to answer phones, was surprised to learn that I have the authority to evaluate his performance and influence his compensation." The satisfaction in my voice was unmistakable, and my family members exchanged glances that showed they were finally beginning to understand not just what I'd accomplished, but how thoroughly they'd misunderstood my situation. Marcus shook his head in amazement. "Maya, this is incredible. You've been playing chess while the rest of us thought you were struggling with checkers. But why didn't you trust us with the truth?" Sarah asked, her question carrying a note of hurt that I'd been expecting. "We're your family. We would have supported you if we'd known what you were really doing." It was a fair question, and one I'd been preparing to answer since the moment I'd decided to reveal everything. "Because you would have tried to give me advice about how to handle the situation. You would have wanted to help me strategize and plan and optimize my approach. But I needed to figure this out on my own, without input from people who didn't understand the specific challenges I was facing." I paused, trying to find words that would explain my reasoning without sounding accusatory. "You've all been very successful in your own careers, but none of you have experience with inherited corporate ownership or classified legal restrictions. Your advice, however well-intentioned, would have been based on assumptions that didn't apply to my situation." My father nodded slowly, his business experience helping him understand the logic of my approach. "You needed to develop your own expertise before making major decisions. That's actually quite sophisticated strategic thinking. It's also," my mother added with a mixture of pride and exasperation, "the most elaborate long-term plan any of my children have ever executed without telling me about it." The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, with my family asking detailed questions about everything from the board meeting dynamics to my plans for the company's future direction. They wanted to understand not just what had happened, but how I'd managed to maintain my cover for 3 years while gathering the intelligence I needed to be effective. Sarah was particularly fascinated by the corporate governance aspects of my situation. "So you're telling me that you've been conducting a 3-year undercover investigation of your own company? That's either brilliant or completely insane." "Why can't it be both?" I replied with a laugh. "The best strategies usually are." Marcus was more interested in the business implications of the changes I was implementing. "What kind of resistance are you getting from the existing management team? They can't be happy about suddenly having their decisions scrutinized by someone they thought was just support staff." The reactions have been mixed, I said diplomatically. Some people are embracing the opportunity for improvement, while others are still processing the change in dynamic. I told them about Tom Bradley's collaborative approach and Jennifer Walsh's defensive maneuvering, about Rachel Kim's political calculations and David Harrison's stunned silence. Each story illustrated a different aspect of how people respond when their assumptions about power and authority are suddenly overturned. The most interesting part, I added, is watching people realize that their treatment of me over the past 3 years is now being evaluated by someone who has the authority to influence their career prospects. My father winced at the implication. I imagine some of them are having uncomfortable conversations with themselves about how they've been conducting themselves professionally. Professional karma is a powerful force, I agreed. People who built their authority on dismissing other people's contributions are discovering that their victims sometimes have more power than they realized. As the evening wound down, my family's perspective on my life had undergone a complete transformation. The daughter they'd been worried about was actually the most strategically successful member of the family. The career they'd been encouraging me to abandon was actually a carefully constructed position of corporate power. The life choices they'd been questioning were actually evidence of sophisticated long-term planning. But more than just changing their understanding of my circumstances, the revelation had forced them to confront their own assumptions about success, ambition, and family dynamics. They'd been so focused on conventional markers of achievement that they'd completely missed the substance of what I was actually accomplishing. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said as we were cleaning up the dinner dishes. "Not just for underestimating your situation, but for being so condescending about your choices. I thought I was being helpful, but I was actually being incredibly presumptuous." Marcus nodded in agreement. "We all were. We were so busy trying to fix what we thought was wrong with your life that we never bothered to ask if maybe you had things under control." My mother hugged me tightly as I prepared to leave. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Not just for what you've accomplished, but for how you've handled everything. The patience, the planning, the way you've used your position to help other people. That's exactly the kind of person your grandfather hoped you'd become." The drive home gave me time to process the emotional complexity of the evening. Sharing the truth with my family had been satisfying in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Not just because it vindicated my choices, but because it allowed us to have honest conversations about ambition, success, and the assumptions families make about each other's lives. But the real satisfaction wasn't in proving my family wrong about my situation. It was in finally being able to be completely authentic with the people I loved most. For 3 years, I'd been hiding a fundamental part of my identity from the people who thought they knew me best. Now, finally, they could see me clearly. Monday morning at Meridian Technologies brought the first meeting of the Strategic Review Committee I'd been organizing. The conference room was filled with representatives from every department, along with external board members and executive staff. It was the kind of comprehensive organizational discussion that should have been happening regularly, but had been neglected for years. Patricia Hernandez opened the meeting with remarks about the importance of systematic evaluation and continuous improvement. She emphasized that the review process wasn't about assigning blame for past problems, but about identifying opportunities for future enhancement. Her tone set exactly the right atmosphere for productive discussion. Tom Bradley presented the baseline financial data we'd been developing, including analysis of employee turnover costs, client satisfaction trends, and operational efficiency metrics. The numbers painted a clear picture of an organization that had been prioritizing short-term cost savings over long-term sustainability, with predictably negative results. When it was my turn to speak, I presented the comprehensive framework for organizational assessment that I'd been developing since the board meeting. The plan included employee feedback surveys, client satisfaction analysis, policy review procedures, and leadership effectiveness evaluations. Most importantly, it established clear timelines and accountability measures for implementing improvements. The goal, I explained to the assembled group, isn't to revolutionize everything overnight. It's to create systems and processes that ensure we're consistently working toward improvement rather than just reacting to problems after they become crises. The discussion that followed was exactly what I'd been hoping for: substantive, collaborative, and focused on practical solutions rather than political maneuvering. Department representatives shared insights about operational challenges that executive management had been unaware of. External board members asked probing questions about resource allocation and strategic priorities. Even David Harrison contributed constructively, though his participation carried a notably subdued tone compared to his usual commanding presence. Maria Santos, representing the Customer Service Department, spoke eloquently about the impact of recent policy changes on employee morale and client relationships. Her presentation was professional, detailed, and compelling, exactly the kind of employee input that should have been sought before implementing major organizational changes. The consolidation of customer service and technical support seemed logical from a cost perspective, she said, but it created confusion for clients who now have to explain their issues multiple times to different representatives. It also increased stress for employees who are trying to handle requests outside their expertise areas. Her analysis perfectly illustrated the kind of ground-level intelligence that executive decision-making had been lacking. Policy changes that looked efficient on organizational charts created real problems for the people who actually had to implement them and the clients who had to navigate them. Jennifer Walsh's contribution to the discussion was notably defensive, focusing on industry standards and regulatory compliance rather than effectiveness or employee satisfaction. She clearly understood that her department's practices were under scrutiny, and she was trying to justify existing policies rather than exploring opportunities for improvement. But the overall tone of the meeting was positive and forward-looking. People were genuinely excited about the possibility of creating a more responsive and supportive organizational culture. The energy in the room reminded me why I'd been so motivated to pursue this path in the first place. As the meeting concluded, Patricia Hernandez announced that the Strategic Review Committee would meet weekly for the next 3 months, with interim reports to the full board at monthly intervals. The timeline was aggressive but achievable, and it demonstrated the board's commitment to systematic improvement rather than superficial changes. Walking back to my office, I now had an actual office rather than a reception desk. I reflected on how dramatically my daily experience had changed in less than a week. Instead of answering phones and filing documents, I was leading strategic initiatives and collaborating with senior management on organizational development. The work was more challenging and more meaningful than anything I'd done during my 3 years of observation. But the most satisfying aspect wasn't the increase in my own authority or responsibility. It was seeing the positive changes that were already beginning to emerge throughout the organization. Employees were more engaged in their work, knowing that their feedback would actually influence company policies. Managers were more thoughtful in their decision-making, understanding that their leadership effectiveness would be systematically evaluated. Even executive staff were approaching their responsibilities with renewed focus and accountability. The transformation wasn't complete. Real cultural change would take months or years to fully implement. But the foundation had been established, and the momentum was building in the right direction. That afternoon, I received a visit from Kevin Santos, who had been promoted to head of building security as part of the organizational improvements we were implementing. His promotion was based on his demonstrated reliability, professional competence, and genuine respect for all building occupants regardless of their job titles or hierarchical positions. Ms. Maya, he said, though his tone had shifted to reflect our new professional relationship, I wanted to thank you for recommending me for this promotion. I also wanted you to know that the changes you're implementing are already making a difference for a lot of people who work here. His gratitude was touching, but it also reminded me of the responsibility that came with my newfound authority. People were counting on me to follow through on the commitments I'd made, and to ensure that the improvements we were implementing would be sustained over time. You earned that promotion through your own professionalism and dedication, I replied. I just made sure that your contributions were recognized by people who have the authority to act on them. As Kevin left my office, I thought about my grandfather and the vision he'd had when he structured his investment to eventually give me influence over Meridian Technologies' direction. He'd understood that successful businesses needed leaders who valued all stakeholders, not just shareholders and executives. He'd believed that companies could be both profitable and ethical, both efficient and humane. The work we were doing to transform Meridian Technologies was honoring that vision, while creating real improvements in people's daily working lives. It was the kind of meaningful professional achievement that couldn't be measured in salary levels or job titles, but it was more satisfying than anything I could have accomplished through conventional career advancement. 6 months later, the transformation of Meridian Technologies had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Employee turnover had decreased by 60%. Client satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Financial performance had improved substantially, as the costs of constant recruitment and training were replaced by the benefits of retention and experience. More importantly, the organizational culture had evolved into something that my grandfather would have been proud to be associated with. People treated each other with respect regardless of their hierarchical positions. Decision-making processes included input from employees at all levels. Professional development opportunities were allocated based on transparent criteria rather than executive favoritism. David Harrison had resigned 3 months after the strategic review began, citing personal reasons but clearly understanding that his leadership style was incompatible with the changes we were implementing. His replacement was a collaborative leader who understood that sustainable success required both financial discipline and human investment. Jennifer Walsh had adapted to the new environment more successfully than I'd expected, ultimately embracing the employee-centered approach that the strategic review had recommended. Her transformation from defensive bureaucrat to genuine advocate for workplace improvement had been one of the most pleasant surprises of the entire process. The success of our organizational transformation had attracted attention from other companies and business schools interested in studying our approach. My role had evolved from board member to recognized expert in corporate governance and organizational development, with speaking invitations and consulting opportunities that I carefully balanced with my ongoing responsibilities at Meridian Technologies. But the most meaningful recognition came from my grandfather's attorney, who visited me on the anniversary of his passing to share a letter that had been sealed until my first year of board service was complete. The letter was brief but powerful. Maya, if you're reading this, it means you've successfully used your inheritance to influence Meridian Technologies in positive ways. I always believed that you had the intelligence and integrity necessary to honor the values that originally made this company successful. Thank you for proving that businesses can be both profitable and principled. Your parents and siblings will never fully understand what you've accomplished, but I do, and I'm proud of the leader you've become. Reading those words in my grandfather's careful handwriting, I understood that the transformation I'd achieved wasn't just professional, it was personal. I'd grown from an uncertain college graduate into a confident leader who could create positive change for hundreds of people, while honoring the values and vision of someone I'd loved and respected. The journey from invisible secretary to corporate leader had taught me that real success isn't about external recognition or conventional achievements. It's about having the patience to develop your capabilities, the wisdom to understand complex situations, and the courage to act when action is needed. Standing in my office overlooking downtown Austin, watching employees leave the building with the kind of satisfaction that comes from meaningful work and respectful treatment, I finally understood what my grandfather had seen in me all those years ago. He'd recognized that I had the potential to be the kind of leader who could make businesses more human without making them less successful. The woman who had spent 3 years answering phones and filing documents was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true leadership means creating opportunities for other people to succeed. The family disappointment had become the family success story, though the real measure of that success wasn't in financial returns or professional recognition. It was in the daily experience of people who deserved dignity and respect in their working lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.